He did not flinch when the leather sliced his skin. He simply closed his hand around the violence and ended it. England, 1852. The crisp air of late October bit at the exposed skin of the guests gathered on the manicured lawns of Wickham Park, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and the metallic tang of fresh game. It was the height of the hunting season, a time when the landed gentry of the county converged to celebrate their dominance over nature with loud voices, excessive brandy, and the thunder of gunfire. For the men standing in their tweed coats and polished boots, the afternoon was a triumph. For Miss Clara Stelmore, it was a test of endurance that felt unending. Clara moved through the crowd with her head bowed, her gaze fixed resolutely on the trampled grass beneath her thin, worn shoes. She carried a heavy silver tray laden with crystal tumblers and a decanter of the Earl's finest port, the weight of it straining her arms until the muscles trembled with a dull, aching burn. She was invisible to them, a ghost in a grey woolen dress that had seen too many washings and now hung loosely on her frame. At 22, Clara should have been among the women in the parlour, sipping tea and discussing the latest poetry from London. Instead, she was here, serving the very men who had once been her father's acquaintances, hoping against hope that the severe way she had pinned back her honey blonde hair and the grime of the scullery on her face would be enough to mask her identity. She had not eaten since the previous morning. The hunger was a sharp, clawing thing in her stomach, making the world tilt dangerously at the edges of her vision. The laughter of the men was a raucous assault on her senses. Lord Malcolm, the Earl of Wickham, stood at the centre of the group, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy red from drink and exertion. He was a large man, prone to excess in all things, and he was currently recounting the kill of the day with a vulgarity that made Clara's stomach turn. "Clean shot," Wickham bellowed, gesturing with a thick, ring-adorned hand. "Right through the heart. The beast didn't even twitch. That is how you handle an unruly creature, gentlemen. You put it down before it knows it's dead." The men around him chuckled, raising their glasses in a toast to their host's marksmanship. Clara approached the circle cautiously, stepping around the muddied boots and discarded riding crops. She needed to refill the empty glasses and retreat before anyone looked at her too closely. She kept her eyes lowered, the vibrant green irises hidden beneath thick lashes, focusing only on the task. Standing slightly apart from the boisterous group was a figure that commanded attention not by noise, but by an absolute, chilling stillness. Sebastian Stirling, the Duke of Alverton, did not laugh at the Earl's coarse jokes. He stood like a statue carved from midnight and marble, his back straight, his profile sharp against the grey autumn sky. He wore a coat of dark navy wool that fit his broad shoulders with the precision of a master tailor, devoid of the flashy embellishments that the Earl favoured. He held a glass of untouched wine in one hand, his expression one of profound, aristocratic boredom. Clara felt his presence before she saw him. There was a gravity to him, a pull that made the air feel heavier in his vicinity. She dared a fleeting glance, and was immediately struck by the intensity of his eyes, dark blue, like the ocean at night, and currently fixed on the horizon, as if he wished to be anywhere but here. He was known as the Iron Duke among the servants, a man of immense wealth and influence who rarely smiled and never forgave a slight. He had no scars on his face, his skin was pale and flawless, yet there was something wounded in the set of his jaw, a hardness that suggested he had seen things far worse than a fox hunt. "You there, girl?" The Earl's booming voice snapped Clara back to reality. She flinched, the tray rattling in her grip. "My glass is empty. Are you deaf as well as slow?" "I apologise, my lord," Clara murmured, her voice a rough whisper. She stepped forward, the heavy silver tray dipping dangerously as her arms spasmed with fatigue. She reached for the decanter, her fingers stiff from the cold. "Look at her," Wickham sneered to his companions, gesturing at Clara as if she were a prize mare at an auction. "Skin and bones. It's impossible to get good help these days. They all want to be fed like queens but work like invalids." Clara bit the inside of her cheek, tasting copper. She remembered a time, not so long ago, when she had sat at a table similar to the one inside the manor, eating roast duck and laughing with her father, the Baron Stelmore. Now, the Baron was dead, buried in a grave that Wickham had likely paid for, with the money he stole from her inheritance. The injustice of it burned hotter than the shame, but she forced it down. Survival required silence. As she poured the port into the Earl's glass, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over her. The black spots dancing in her vision coalesced into a blinding veil. Her knee buckled, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The heavy crystal decanter slipped from her numbed fingers. Time seemed to slow. Clara watched in horror as the vessel tumbled through the air, catching the weak afternoon light. It struck the edge of the silver tray before crashing onto the stone pathway directly beside the Earl's polished riding boots. The sound was explosive, a shattering of glass that cut through the laughter and conversation like a gunshot. Dark red port splashed violently, soaking the hem of Clara's grey dress and, more disastrously, splattering across the pristine white breeches and leather boots of the Earl of Wickham. Silence descended upon the lawn. It was absolute and terrifying. The birds seemed to stop singing. The wind ceased its rustling in the trees. Every eye turned to the scene. Clara stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she stared at the mess she had made. "You clumsy, stupid bitch." The Earl's roar shattered the quiet. His face turned a shade of purple that clashed violently with his cravat. He looked down at his ruined boots, then up at Clara, his eyes bulging with an apoplectic rage. "Do you have any idea how much this cost? Do you?" I am so sorry, my lord," Clara stammered, dropping to her knees instinctively to pick up the shards, heedless of the glass cutting into her cold fingers. "I will clean it. I will—" "Clean it?" Wickham spat, stepping back and wiping his boot on the grass. "You have ruined it. You are worthless, utterly worthless." The humiliation was not enough for him. The Earl, fueled by alcohol and the perceived slight to his dignity in front of his peers, reached for the riding crop tucked into his belt. It was a vicious thing, made of braided leather with a heavy silver handle. He gripped it until his knuckles turned white. "I will teach you a lesson you will not soon forget," Wickham snarled. He loomed over her, a towering figure of wrath. Clara cowered, curling into herself on the damp grass, throwing her hands up to protect her face. She closed her eyes, bracing for the sting, the pain that she knew was coming. She had seen him strike dogs with less provocation. The whistle of the whip cutting through the air was a high-pitched shriek. Clara stopped breathing, but the blow never landed. Instead of the crack of leather against flesh, there was a dull, heavy thud, the sound of impact against something solid. Clara opened her eyes, trembling. A hand had appeared in her field of vision. A large, masculine hand, pale and strong. It was hovering inches from her face, suspended in the air. The fingers were wrapped tightly around the lash of the Earl's riding crop, halting its downward trajectory with an immovable force. Slowly, terrified, Clara looked up. Standing between her and the Earl was the Duke of Alverton. Sebastian Stirling had moved with a speed that belied his earlier stillness. He stood firm, his boots planted in the grass, his arm extended like a bar of iron. He was not looking at Clara. His dark blue eyes were locked onto the Earl's face, and they were cold enough to freeze the blood in Wickham's veins. "Your Grace!" Wickham sputtered, his rage faltering into confusion. He tried to yank the whip back, but the Duke's grip was unyielding. "What is the meaning of this?" "Step aside. The girl needs discipline." "Discipline," Sebastian repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a curse. His voice was low, devoid of emotion, yet it carried across the lawn with terrifying clarity. "Is that what you call beating a starving woman in front of your guests, Wickham? I call it something else." "She ruined my boots," Wickham protested, his voice rising in a whine that sounded pathetic against the Duke's baritone. "Look at the mess. She is my servant, and I will chastise her as I see fit." Sebastian did not answer immediately. Instead, he tightened his grip on the leather lash. The whip had bite. It was designed to cut the hide of horses. As the Duke squeezed, The leather sliced into the unprotected palm of his hand. A single drop of bright crimson blood welled up between his fingers. Then another. It ran in a stark, shocking line down his wrist, disappearing into the cuff of his pristine white shirt. Clara gasped, the sound loud in the silence. The gathered men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. To strike a servant was common. To draw the blood of a duke was a catastrophe. "You are bleeding," Wickham whispered, his face draining of colour. The riding crop fell from his hand as he released it, as if it had suddenly become red hot. Sebastian remained holding the lash, the blood now dripping freely onto the grass, mingling with the spilled port. "So I am," Sebastian said calmly. He dropped the whip to the ground with a look of disdain. He did not look at his wounded hand. He kept his gaze pinned to the Earl. "You have a habit of making messes, my lord. First with your wine, and now with my blood." I did not intend," Wickham stammered, taking a step back. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. "It was an accident, Your Grace. I was aiming for the girl. You stepped in the way." "And lucky for you that I did," Sebastian said, taking a step forward, forcing the Earl to retreat further. "Because if you had struck her while I stood here and did nothing, I would have been forced to question whether you are fit to hold the title of a gentleman. And when I question such things, Wickham, the answers often have unpleasant consequences for those involved." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. The Duke of Alverton was one of the most powerful peers in the realm. A word from him could close doors in London, ruin credit at the banks, and turn a man into a social pariah. Wickham knew it. The arrogance drained out of him, leaving only fear. "I apologize, Your Grace," Wickham mumbled, bowing his head. "It was the heat of the moment. Please, let me send for a physician." "Your hand, my hand will heal," Sebastian cut him off. He finally turned his head, looking down at Clara. She was still on her knees, surrounded by glass, shivering violently. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world narrowed down to just the two of them. She saw no pity in his blue gaze, only a sharp, calculating assessment. He looked at her not as a broken thing, but as a puzzle he had just decided to solve. He looked at the curve of her cheek, the distinctive shade of her eyes, and the way she held her chin up despite the terror. "However," Sebastian continued, turning back to the Earl, "you have incurred a debt today, Wickham. You have ruined the peace of my afternoon, and you have drawn my blood. I expect compensation." "Anything, Your Grace," Wickham said quickly, eager to make the problem disappear. "Name your price. I have a new stallion, purebred Arabian." "I have no need of horses," Sebastian said dismissively. He gestured vaguely toward the ground, toward Clara. "I will take her." Wickham blinked, confused. "The girl? But she is useless, clumsy, a wretch." "Then you should be glad to be rid of her," Sebastian said. His tone was final. "She leaves with me. Now." "But she is indentured to the estate," Wickham protested weakly, trying to salvage some scrap of authority. "Her father left debts." Sebastian took one step closer to the Earl, invading his personal space with an air of menace. "Do you wish to discuss debts, Wickham? Shall we discuss the debt you now owe me for the injury to my person? Or perhaps we should discuss the nature of these debts her father left in a court of law." Wickham paled even further. "Take her," he choked out. "Take the girl, and go." Sebastian nodded once, satisfied. He extended his uninjured hand toward Clara. "Stand up." It was not a request. It was a command. Clara hesitated, her mind reeling. She was being traded like a sack of grain. But looking at the Duke's extended hand, a hand that had not struck her but saved her, she realized she had no choice. Staying meant the Earl's wrath once the guests were gone. Going meant the unknown. She reached out, her fingers trembling and stained with dust, and placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and warm. He pulled her to her feet with an effortless strength, steadying her when she swayed from dizziness. "Walk," he instructed softly, leaning down so only she could hear. "Do not look back. Do not cower. Walk as if you belong nowhere else but by my side." Clara swallowed hard, nodding. She straightened her spine, channeling every ounce of the noble training she had received as a child. She lifted her chin, ignoring the whispers of the men as they passed, ignoring the burning hatred in the Earl's eyes. Sebastian led her across the lawn, away from the blood and the wine, toward the gravel drive where his carriage awaited. It was a magnificent vehicle, black lacquer gleaming in the fading light, with the Alverton crest emblazoned in gold on the door. A footman in livery hurried to open the door, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the Duke's bleeding hand and the dishevelled servant girl at his side, but he was too well trained to speak. "Inside," Sebastian said, gesturing for her to enter. Clara climbed the steps, the velvet interior of the carriage looking like a sanctuary she did not deserve. She sank into the plush squabs, the scent of leather and cedar enveloping her. Sebastian followed her. He paused on the step, turning back one last time to look at the gathering on the lawn. The Earl of Wickham was watching them, a small, defeated figure against the grand backdrop of his stolen estate. Sebastian's expression was unreadable, cold and distant as the moon. Then he stepped inside and pulled the door shut, sealing them away from the world. The carriage rocked as the horses were whipped into motion. The wheels crunched over the gravel, picking up speed, putting distance between Clara and the hell she had lived in for the past year. She sat huddled in the corner, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Across from her, the Duke of Alverton sat back, resting his head against the squabs. He lifted his injured hand, inspecting the cut that still oozed blood, staining his white cuff crimson. He did not groan or complain. He merely watched the blood with that same detached curiosity, as if it belonged to someone else. Clara stared at the wound, the reality of what had happened crashing down on her. A duke had bled for her. The thought was terrifying. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The single word felt inadequate, but it was all she had. Sebastian turned his gaze from his hand to her face. In the dim light of the carriage, his blue eyes were shadowed, mysterious and intense. "Because," he said simply, his voice low and vibrating through the small space, "I have a distaste for bullies, Miss Stelmore. And I have an even greater distaste for wasted potential." Clara froze at the sound of her name. He knew who she was. Before she could ask how or what he meant, the carriage turned onto the main road, the horses breaking into a gallop, carrying them away from Wickham Park and toward a destiny that Clara could not yet imagine. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor of the carriage, linking the servant girl and the Duke in the darkness. The interior of the carriage was a world unto itself, a capsule of velvet and polished mahogany that smelled of cedar, old leather, and the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood. The rhythmic clatter of the iron-rimmed wheels against the cobblestones created a hypnotic percussion, a stark, rattling contrast to the chaotic violence of the lawn they had just left behind. Outside, the English countryside was being swallowed by the gathering twilight, the ancient oaks turning into gnarled silhouettes against a sky bruising purple and grey. Inside, the silence stretched taut and suffocating, heavier than the velvet curtains drawn against the chill. Clara sat pressed deeply into the corner of the plush seat, her body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline that coursed through her veins like ice water. She gripped the folds of her worn grey dress, the fabric rough against her fingers, trying to anchor herself to reality. Opposite her, Sebastian Sterling sat with the stillness of a statue carved from midnight and marble. His face was obscured by the shadows that danced across the cabin as the carriage passed beneath the overhanging branches of the trees lining the road, but his presence filled the small space, commanding and inescapable. He had not spoken a single word since the heavy door had clicked shut at Wickham Park. He simply held his injured hand elevated, resting his wrist on his knee in a detached, clinical manner. He watched the slow, dark crimson trail that snaked its way down his skin, staining the pristine white of his cuff, with an expression of profound boredom, as if the pain belonged to a stranger. Clara could not bear it. The instinct to heal, to mend what was broken, was as ingrained in her as the manners her late father had instilled in her before the world fell apart. She shifted forward, the movement rustling her skirts loudly in the quiet. The Duke's eyes, dark blue and impenetrable, snapped to her face instantly. They were not kind eyes, nor were they cruel. They were intensely observant, assessing her as one might assess a mathematical problem. "You are bleeding profusely, Your Grace," Clara said, her voice finding a steadiness she did not feel. "If you do not bind that wound, you will ruin the upholstery. I imagine the stains will be far harder to remove than the port wine I spilled on the Earl's boots." It was a bold thing to say to a man who effectively held her life in his hands, a man known to the county as the Iron Duke for his unyielding nature. But Sebastian's lips twitched, a ghost of a reaction that might have been amusement or perhaps surprise. "I have ruined many things today, Miss Stelmore," he replied, his voice a deep baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the carriage. "A pair of boots, a garden party, and Lord Wickham's composure. The upholstery seems a small price to pay for such entertainment." "The cut is deep," Clara insisted, ignoring his deflection. She could see the angry red line where the leather lash had bitten into his flesh. It was a wound that would scar if not treated with care. She reached into the pocket of her apron, searching for a handkerchief, but found only a rough, stained rag she used for polishing silver in the scullery. She frowned, withdrawing her hand empty, shame colouring her cheeks. She could not press that filth against an open wound of a peer of the realm. Without hesitation, she reached for the hem of her underskirt. It was cotton, simple and frayed at the edges, but it was clean. She gripped the fabric and tore a long strip from the bottom, the sound of ripping cloth loud and jarring in the confined space. Sebastian watched her, his eyebrows raising slightly, the shadow of arrogance slipping for a moment. "Resourceful. Necessary," she corrected quietly. She moved from her seat to the one adjacent to him, closing the distance between their worlds. The scent of him, sandalwood, rain, and the metallic scent of blood, filled her senses. "May I?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze searching hers for any sign of tremors or revulsion. Finding none, he extended his hand. Clara took it gently, cradling his fingers in hers. His skin was warm, his hand large and calloused from riding, not the soft, pampered hand of a courtier who spent his days in parlours. "This will sting," she warned softly, aligning the strip of cotton. "I am not a child, Miss Stelmore," he replied dryly, looking away toward the darkened window. "Proceed." Clara began to wrap the improvised bandage around his hand, pulling the cotton tight to apply pressure. She worked with efficient, practiced movements, her fingers nimble despite the cold that seeped through the carriage walls. She had spent the last year nursing her mother through bouts of consumption before the separation, and before that, she had often tended to the tenants on her father's estate when the local physician was too drunk or too distant to attend. She knew the language of pain and how to silence it. "You have the hands of a healer, not a scullery maid," Sebastian observed, his voice low. He was watching her face now, studying the way her brow furrowed in concentration. "Where did you learn to dress a laceration with such precision? Wickham's kitchens do not typically offer lessons in surgery." "My father believed that a lady's education should extend beyond embroidery and the pianoforte," Clara murmured, tying off the knot at his wrist with a firm tug. She sat back, putting a respectable distance between them once more, tucking her hands into her lap to hide their shaking. "He taught me that to lead an estate was to serve those who lived upon it. That included tending to their injuries when necessary. He said a title was a responsibility, not merely a privilege. Baron Stelmore was a rare breed," Sebastian said. It was a statement of fact, devoid of the mockery she had grown accustomed to hearing from men of his station. "I met him once, years ago in London, at the House of Lords. He spoke of his library with more passion than he spoke of the Corn Laws. He struck me as a man of intellect and conscience." Clara felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief in her chest, so acute it nearly stole her breath. Hearing her father's name spoken with respect, after a year of hearing Wickham drag it through the mud and erase his legacy, was almost enough to undo her. She blinked rapidly, forcing the tears back. She would not cry in front of this stranger. "He was," she whispered, her voice thick. "He loved his books more than anything, save for my mother and myself. He spent his life building that collection. And yet," Sebastian's tone shifted, becoming sharper, more interrogative, slicing through the sentimental atmosphere. His daughter was found on her knees in the mud, serving drinks to men not fit to polish her father's boots. How did this happen, Clara? How does a baron's daughter fall so far, so fast? The use of her given name was a shock, stripping away the formality of the moment. It was intimate and imperious all at once. Clara looked down at her hands, the rough red knuckles intertwined in her lap. The hands of a servant, not a lady. You know how it happened. You said it yourself on the lawn, she replied bitterly. Debts. Ruin. The story is common enough. Wickham's version of events is rarely the truth, Sebastian countered. He reached into his vest pocket with his uninjured hand and pulled out a small glittering object attached to a fine gold chain. He held it up in the narrow shaft of moonlight filtering through the window. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her neck. She had not even felt him take it. That is mine. It is the Stelmore signet, Sebastian said, ignoring her protest, watching the gold catch the light. A hawk holding a quill. I saw the glint of it when you bent to clean the broken glass. You wore it hidden, tucked inside your dress, pressed against your skin. A servant might steal a ring, Miss Stelmore, but she would sell it for bread or gin to numb the cold. She would not wear it against her heart like a holy relic. That was when I knew. You were not just a girl Wickham had hired from the village. You were the legacy he had tried to erase. He extended his hand, letting the ring drop back into her palm. Clara clutched it tightly, the metal warm from his touch, pressing the sharp edges into her skin to ground herself. Wickham was my father's cousin, Clara began, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. The carriage rocked violently over a rut, but she didn't pause. When Papa died of the fever last winter, Wickham arrived with papers before the earth was even settled on the grave. He claimed my father had made bad investments in the colonies, sugar and silk that never arrived. He said the estate was bankrupt, that everything, the house, the lands, the furniture, even my mother's jewellery, belonged to the creditors. Sebastian listened, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on hers. And let me guess, he purchased the debt out of familial charity. He called it mercy, Clara scoffed, a dark sound that felt foreign in her throat. He told me I had two choices. I could leave destitute with my mother who was too ill to travel, with the winter setting in. Or I could work off the debt. He said if I served him, if I lowered myself to the scullery and disappeared from society, he would pay for my mother's care in a private sanatorium in the north. He said if I refused, or if I tried to run, he would throw her into the streets to die. Sebastian's expression darkened, his jaw tightening until a muscle leaped in his cheek. The temperature in the carriage seemed to drop. So, you sold your pride to buy her life? I did what I had to do, Clara said fiercely, lifting her chin, daring him to judge her. I would scrub floors until my hands bled if it meant she was warm and fed. I would do it 1,000 times over. But I have not heard from her in 3 months. Wickham claims she is well, but he refuses to let me see her. He says my presence would upset her fragile constitution. He holds her hostage to keep me obedient. Lies, Sebastian murmured. Calculated, cruel lies designed to keep you compliant. Wickham uses people like he uses horses, until they break, and then he discards them. I fear you are right, Clara whispered, the terror she kept at bay finally surfacing. But I had no power to challenge him. I was a woman alone, without money, without friends. The society that drank my father's wine turned their backs the moment the money was gone. I was invisible. Not everyone, Sebastian corrected softly. You are not alone now. The carriage began to slow, the rhythm of the wheels changing as they turned onto a smoother, paved drive. The sound of gravel crunching beneath the wheels signalled an arrival. Sebastian looked out the window, his face illuminated by the passing torchlight of the estate gates. We have arrived, he announced. Clara leaned toward the glass, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Through the darkness, she saw the silhouette of a massive structure rising against the night sky. Alverton Hall was not merely a house. It was a fortress of stone and history. a testament to centuries of sterling power. Turrets pierced the clouds, and hundreds of windows glowed with warm, inviting light, casting long reflections on the decorative lakes that flanked the drive. It was grander than anything she had ever known, a palace compared to the modest manor of her childhood. Panic rose in her throat, tasting of bile. "What am I to do here, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I cannot be your guest. The scandal would destroy whatever shred of reputation I have left, and it would tarnish yours. And I cannot be your servant. I do not think I can bear to serve another man who looks at me with pity. I am too tired." "I do not pity you, Clara," Sebastian said, turning to her. The intensity of his gaze pinned her to the seat. "I respect you. There is a vast difference, and you will be neither guest nor servant." The carriage came to a halt. The door was pulled open by a footman in blue livery. Sebastian stepped out first, ignoring the hand offered to assist him. He turned and held out his uninjured hand to Clara. She took it, stepping down onto the gravel drive. The air here was cleaner, smelling of pine, frost, and ancient stone. Before them, the great oak doors of the hall were thrown open, spilling golden light onto the limestone steps. A line of servants stood waiting. A butler with posture as stiff as a board, a housekeeper with a ring of keys at her waist, and several footmen, all standing at attention. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the butler intoned, bowing low. His eyes flickered to Clara, widening slightly at her attire, the stained grey wool, the torn apron, but he was too well trained to speak. "We were not expecting company." "This is not company, Reynolds," Sebastian said, his voice projecting clearly to the staff, cutting through the night air. He drew Clara forward, not hiding her, but presenting her. "This is Miss Clara Stelmore. She is the daughter of the late Baron Stelmore." A ripple of shock went through the staff. They knew the name. The fall of the Stelmore family had been the talk of the county for a year. To see the daughter of a baron dressed as a scullery maid, standing beside the Duke, was a sight that defied all protocol. "Miss Stelmore has agreed to assist me with a project of great importance," Sebastian lied smoothly, though his tone suggested that to question him was to invite immediate dismissal. "The library has fallen into disarray since my father's time. Many of the manuscripts are uncatalogued and in danger of decay. Miss Stelmore is a scholar of considerable talent. She has graciously accepted the position of archivist and librarian for Alverton Hall." Clara stared at him, stunned into silence. A librarian. It was a position of dignity, of intellect. It was a job that would allow her to live under his roof not as a beggar or a maid, but as an employee of status, a professional. It gave her a reason to be here that society could, if not entirely accept, at least understand. It was a shield. "Reynolds," Sebastian continued, "prepare the East Suite for Miss Stelmore, not the servants' quarters, the guest wing. She will require a hot bath, a meal, and fresh clothing. Send for the modiste in the village tomorrow morning. The Alverton librarian must be dressed appropriately for her station. Put the costs on my personal account." "At once, Your Grace," Reynolds said, recovering his composure and bowing to Clara this time with genuine respect. "Miss Stelmore, if you will follow Mrs. Hess, she will see to your immediate comfort." Clara felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were tears of overwhelming relief. She looked up at Sebastian. He was not looking at her. He was already pulling off his gloves, his duty done, his mask of indifference back in place. "Go," he said softly, finally glancing down at her. "Rest. We begin the work of reclaiming your life tomorrow. Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. "For the bandage, for the lie, for saving me." "It is not a lie," Sebastian said, his voice dropping so only she could hear, an intimacy that sent a shiver down her spine. "I do need a librarian. My books are in chaos, and I need you, Clara, because I suspect that in those ledgers and papers Wickham stole, there are secrets that can hang him, and you are the only one who knows where to look. I can fight him with laws and money, but you can fight him with the truth." "I will find it," she promised, gripping the signet ring in her palm. If the truth exists, I will find it. Good, Sebastian said. Then tonight, you sleep in a bed made of feathers, not straw. Tonight, you are safe. He turned and strode into the house, his long coat billowing behind him, leaving Clara standing on the steps, breathing in the cold, clean air of freedom for the first time in a year. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman with a purpose. Clara followed the housekeeper, Mrs. Hess, a plump woman with a kind face who clucked sympathetically at the state of Clara's dress. They walked through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch her with judging eyes. But Clara met their gazes with her head held high. The house was vast, a labyrinth of marble and mahogany, smelling of beeswax and lavender. The Duke is a good man, miss, Mrs. Hess said as they ascended the grand staircase. Stern, yes. He demands perfection. But he is fair. He has never brought a lady home like this before. You must be special. I am not special, Clara replied quietly. I am simply lucky. But as she was led into a suite that was larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in, with a fire roaring in the hearth and a copper tub already being filled with steaming water, Clara wondered. The way he had looked at the ring, the way he had let her tend his wound, the way he had challenged an Earl for her, it felt like more than luck. It felt like the beginning of a storm that would either destroy them or cleanse the rot from her life forever. She bathed until the water turned cold, scrubbing the scent of Wickham Park from her skin until she was raw and clean. She ate soup that tasted like heaven. And when she finally climbed into the massive four-poster bed, sinking into the softness, she did not dream of the whip or the mud. She dreamed of a library filled with books, and a man with eyes like the midnight sea who had given her back her name. Tomorrow, the war against Wickham would begin. But tonight, for the first time in a year, Clara Stellmore closed her eyes and slept without fear. 3 weeks had passed since the carriage ride from Wickham Park, and the calendar on the heavy oak desk in the Alverton Library now read November. The autumn had deepened, turning the rolling hills of the estate into a tapestry of russet and gold, while the winds that battered the high windows carried the first biting promise of the winter to come. Inside the library, however, the world was composed of stillness, the scent of beeswax and old vellum, and the rhythmic scratching of a quill against parchment. Clara Stellmore sat at her designated workspace, a smaller desk positioned near the warmth of the great stone hearth. She paused in her writing, lifting her head to look out at the grey sky. The woman reflected in the dark glass of the window was barely recognizable as the scullery maid who had knelt in the mud. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out. Her skin had lost its greyish pallor, glowing now with the health that came from 3 steady meals a day and nights of uninterrupted sleep. Her hair, once dull and hidden beneath a cap, was clean and pinned up in a simple, elegant twist, shining like spun honey in the firelight. She wore a dress of dove-grey wool, not the silk of a lady of leisure, for she insisted on earning her keep, but a garment of quality, warm and well-fitted, devoid of patches or stains. She looked down at her hands. The cracks in her skin were healing, the rawness fading, though the calluses remained as a testament to her survival. She was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of a room. She was the archivist of Alverton Hall, a title that Sebastian had spoken into existence and which the household had accepted with surprising readiness. You have been staring at that same page for 10 minutes, Miss Stellmore, a deep voice noted from the shadows of the upper gallery. Is the genealogy of the third Duke proving too tedious, or has your mind wandered to more pressing matters? Clara turned, a smile touching her lips, as Sebastian descended the spiral iron staircase. He moved with a feline grace that always seemed at odds with his imposing size. He was dressed in his customary dark colours, a black frock coat and a charcoal waistcoat, his cravat tied with severe precision. The bandage on his hand was gone, replaced by a thin, healing scar that ran diagonally across his palm, a mark she caught a glimpse of whenever he reached for a book. Not tedious, Your Grace, Clara replied, setting down her quill. Merely complex. Your great-grandfather seems to have had a penchant for acquiring land and losing track of the deeds. I am attempting to reconcile the map of the northern borders with the current tenant list. Brie, Sebastian approached her desk, leaning against the edge of it with a casual intimacy that had developed between them over the quiet days of work. He was a man who preferred hunting to accounting, a vice I try not to emulate. "You are succeeding," Clara said softly. "I have never seen a landlord who knows the names of his farmers as well as you do." It was true. In the weeks she had been there, she had seen the Duke manage his vast holdings with an efficiency that bordered on obsession. He was not the idle aristocrat. Wickham was. Sebastian worked, and he expected those around him to work too. It was why he had not treated her as a charity case, but as a colleague. They spent their days in this room, separated by feet of air, but connected by a shared silence and the mutual respect of two intellectual minds. "Competence is the only defense against ruin," Sebastian said, his eyes darkening slightly as if the thought brought a shadow with it. He picked up the book she was working on, his fingers brushing near hers. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a jolt of awareness through Clara that she struggled to hide. "You have done more in 3 weeks to organize this chaos than my father's stewards did in 30 years. You have a gift for order, Clara." He used her name more often now, though only within the sanctuary of the library. Outside those doors, in front of the servants, she was strictly Miss Stelmore. But in here, amongst the dust and the stories, the barriers of rank seemed to thin. "Order is safety," Clara admitted. "When one knows where everything belongs, the world feels less unpredictable." "And are you safe here?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, turning the question into something weightier. "Yes," she whispered. "Cleaner, warmer, safer." "Good." He straightened, moving away from the desk as if the proximity disturbed him. "Because the world outside is not content to leave us in peace. Reynolds tells me a carriage arrived at the main gate 10 minutes ago. It bears the crest of a London law firm known for its aggressive tactics." Clara's blood ran cold. The peace of the library shattered instantly. "Wickham?" "His agents," Sebastian corrected. "The Earl himself is likely too cowardly to face me again so soon. But he has sent his dogs to bark at my door." As if on cue, the double doors of the library opened. Reynolds entered, his face pinched with disapproval. Behind him walked a man who looked as though he had been carved from dried parchment. He was thin, dressed in black that had faded to green at the seams, carrying a leather satchel that bulged with papers. He had the shifting, nervous eyes of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. "Mr. Silas Grimsby, Your Grace," Reynolds announced stiffly, representing the interests of the Earl of Wickham. Sebastian did not offer a bow. He did not even turn fully to face the man. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, radiating an aura of absolute, freezing disdain. "You have 5 minutes, Mr. Grimsby, and I advise you to choose your words with extreme care. The air in this room is precious, and I dislike having it wasted." Mr. Grimsby cleared his throat, clutching his satchel tighter. He looked from the Duke to Clara, his lip curling slightly at the sight of her. "Your Grace, I come with a petition from the magistrate regarding the person of Miss Clara Stelmore. My client, Lord Wickham, is her legal guardian under the terms of her late father's will and the subsequent bankruptcy settlement. Miss Stelmore is an employee of this household," Sebastian said coldly. "She is of age. She requires no guardian." "Ah, but that is the crux of the matter," Grimsby said, producing a document with a flourish. "Lord Wickham has filed a sworn affidavit stating that Miss Stelmore is suffering from severe melancholia and hysteria following the death of her father. He claims she is mentally unfit to make decisions for herself or to enter into employment contracts. He cites her flight from his protection and her current, irregular living situation as proof of her instability." Clara gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white. "That is a lie," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "I am not mad. I fled because he threatened me. He made me a servant in my own home." "Hysterics," Grimsby noted, talking over her as if she were a piece of furniture. He addressed the Duke solely. "You see, Your Grace, the poor girl is delusional. Lord Wickham wishes only to provide her with the medical care she requires. He has arranged for a bed at St. Jude's Asylum for gentlewomen. We have a court order for her immediate transfer into his custody." St. Jude's. The name hit Clara like a physical blow. It was not a hospital. It was a warehouse for unwanted women, a place of cold baths and locked cells. If she went there, she would never be seen again. Sebastian moved. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping inches from the lawyer. Grimsby shrank back, nearly dropping his papers. "Let me be clear," Sebastian said, his voice terrifyingly soft. "If you attempt to touch a member of my staff, or if you dare to suggest again that this woman, whose intellect far surpasses your own, is mad, I will have you thrown from this house, literally." "But the law," Grimsby squeaked. "The law requires evidence," Sebastian snapped. "You claim she is unfit because of the bankruptcy, because of the debts." "Precisely," Grimsby said, rallying slightly. "The stress of the financial ruin brought on the madness." "Then let us examine the ruin," Sebastian declared. He snatched the court order from Grimsby's hand, read it once, and then tore it deliberately in half. "Your Grace, that is an official document." "It is waste paper," Sebastian retorted, tossing the pieces onto the floor. "You want to discuss the law? Very well. I am invoking the clause of verification. As Miss Stelmore's employer, I am liable for any debts she may have incurred. Therefore, before I release her to any guardian, I require proof that the debts necessitating this guardianship actually exist." Grimsby blinked, confused. "The debts are a matter of public record. The Baron died owing thousands." "So Wickham says," Sebastian countered. "But I do not trust Wickham's arithmetic. I demand a full, independent audit of the Stelmore estate. I want to see the ledgers. Every receipt, every tax record, every grain tally from the 5 years preceding the Baron's death. Until I have reviewed those documents and satisfied myself that the bankruptcy was legitimate, Miss Stelmore remains here, under my protection, to assist in the review. If you refuse, I will petition the High Court in London for an investigation into fraud. And I assure you, Mr. Grimsby, my lawyers are far more expensive than you." The lawyer paled. The threat of a fraud investigation involving a duke was a nightmare scenario. "An audit? That would take weeks. The paperwork is extensive." "I have time," Sebastian said, crossing his arms. "And I have a librarian. Bring the books. Bring all of them, or get off my land." Grimsby looked at Clara, then at the Duke's unyielding expression. He realized he was outmatched. I will convey your request to his lordship, but he will not be pleased." "I do not aim to please him," Sebastian said. "Reynolds, escort Mr. Grimsby out, and ensure he counts his fingers before he leaves. I wouldn't want him to accuse us of stealing those too." When the door finally closed, leaving them alone again, the silence that rushed back into the room was heavy with adrenaline. Clara sank into her chair, her legs giving way. "He wants to put me in an asylum," she whispered, the horror of it finally catching up to her. "He knows I'm not mad. He just wants to silence me." Sebastian was beside her in an instant. He did not touch her, but he crouched down so that their faces were level, breaking the distance between them. "He is afraid, Clara. Men like Wickham do not resort to locking women away unless they are terrified of what those women might say. It confirms everything we suspected. But if the audit shows nothing," she began, her eyes wide with panic. "If the books are cooked well enough, then we will look closer," Sebastian vowed. "We will look until our eyes burn. You are not going to St. Jude's. You are staying here. Do you understand me?" She looked into his blue eyes and saw a ferocity there that burned brighter than the fire. "I understand." 3 days later, the peace of the library was shattered, not by a lawyer, but by labourers. A cart from Wickham Park arrived, delivering the requested materials. They were not carried in neat boxes. They were dumped in the centre of the library floor, 6 massive rotting wooden crates that smelled of damp cellars and neglect. Reynolds stood by, holding a handkerchief to his nose. "Shall I have the staff clean them, Your Grace?" "No," Clara said, stepping forward. She looked at the chaotic pile of parchment, bound ledgers, and loose receipts. It was a deliberate insult. Wickham had sent a haystack, daring them to find the needle. "Do not touch a single page. If the order is disturbed, we might lose the trail. We must go through them exactly as they are. Sebastian stood beside her, looking at the mountain of work. He thinks this will discourage us. He thinks we will look at this filth and give up. He took off his fine black coat and tossed it over a chair. Then he rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt, exposing his forearms. It was a shocking breach of protocol for a duke, a gesture of solidarity that made Clara's heart hammer against her ribs. "Where do we begin?" Sebastian asked, looking at her not as a superior, but as a partner. Clara took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of mold and ink, the scent of her father's stolen legacy. "We begin with the harvest of 1848. It was a bumper crop. If the money disappeared, it started there." And so the work began. For the next 2 weeks, the library became their entire world. The days grew shorter, the rain turning to sleet against the windows. But inside, the lamps burned late into the night. They developed a rhythm. Clara would sort the loose receipts, categorizing them by date and vendor, her nimble fingers flying through the paper. Sebastian would take the heavy ledgers, cross-referencing the totals with the bank statements he had subpoenaed from London. It was grueling, tedious work. Their fingers were constantly stained with ink and dust. Their eyes ached. But in the quiet hours past midnight, when the rest of the house slept, a profound intimacy grew between them. They spoke of the numbers, yes, but they spoke of other things too. Clara learned that Sebastian hated the social season because it felt like a market for human flesh. Sebastian learned that Clara had read Plato in the original Greek, taught by her father on rainy afternoons. They argued over the interpretation of tax laws and laughed, quiet, tired laughter, over the absurd extravagance of Wickham's personal expenses found mixed in with the estate bills, £400 for silk waistcoats in a single year. One night, a storm raged outside, rattling the window panes with gale-force winds. The clock on the mantel chimed 2 in the morning. Clara was seated on the floor, surrounded by piles of paper, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Sebastian was at his desk, rubbing his temples. "We are missing something," Sebastian murmured, frustration edging his voice. "The totals are low, yes, but they are consistent. Wickham's accountant is a thief, but a competent one. He has balanced the losses against maintenance costs that are vague enough to be plausible." Clara did not answer immediately. She was holding a small, leather-bound book she had found at the bottom of the 3rd crate. It was not an official ledger. It was a granary log, written in the rough, simple hand of the estate's former overseer, Mr. Higgins, a man who had been loyal to her father. "Sebastian," she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name without the title. She didn't even realize she had done it. He froze, turning to look at her. "What is it?" "Look at this," she said, her voice trembling with the vibrations of discovery. She stood up, her legs stiff, and carried the book to him. She placed it on top of the pristine, falsified ledger he had been studying. "This is the granary intake log for October 1850, she explained, pointing to a column of scribbled numbers. "Mr. Higgins recorded the raw weight of the wheat as it came off the wagons. See here? 50 tons from the north field, 30 from the river pasture. And?" Sebastian asked, leaning closer, his shoulder brushing hers. "And here," she pointed to Wickham's official account book, "is the entry for the sale of that same wheat to the mills in Manchester. It lists only 40 tons total." Sebastian's eyes narrowed, scanning the numbers. 40 tons, so nearly half the harvest vanished between the field and the market. "Wheat does not vanish," Clara said, her heart racing. "It rots, or it is stolen. But if it rots, there is a record of disposal. There is none. And look at the price." She flipped a page in the granary log. Higgins noted the market price that week as 6 shillings a bushel. Wickham's ledger records the sale at 4 shillings. He sold it off the books, Sebastian realized, his voice low and dangerous. He sold half the crop for cash, pocketed the money, and then recorded the rest at a deflated price to show a loss on paper. He didn't just mismanage the estate, Clara. He looted it. He created the bankruptcy, Clara whispered, the enormity of the crime settling over her. My father didn't lose our money. Wickham stole it while Papa was dying. He took the profit from the very land he claimed was failing. This is it, Sebastian said. He looked up from the book, and the expression on his face was terrifying. It was the look of a predator who had finally caught the scent of blood. This is the proof. The discrepancy in weight, combined with the price difference. It proves systematic fraud. He stole thousands, enough to ruin the barony 3 times over. Clara felt a wave of dizziness. Relief, anger, and exhaustion crashed into her all at once. She swayed, her hand gripping the edge of the desk for support. Sebastian moved instantly. His hands caught her upper arms, steadying her. His grip was firm, warm, and electric. For a moment, they stood frozen in the circle of lamplight, the damning evidence forgotten on the desk between them. Clara looked up into his face, seeing the fierce triumph in his eyes soften into something else, something raw and undeniable. "You found it," he said softly, his thumbs brushing the fabric of her sleeves. "You saved yourself, Clara." "I had help," she breathed, unable to look away from his mouth. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The silence of the library was no longer peaceful. It was charged with a tension that had been building for weeks, a magnetic pull that defied logic and station. Sebastian lowered his head slowly, his gaze dropping to her lips. Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She did not pull away. She wanted this. She wanted him to kiss her, to erase the memory of Wickham's cruelty with his touch. But then, the log in the fireplace shifted with a loud crack, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The sound broke the spell. Sebastian pulled back, dropping his hands as if he had been burned. He stepped away, turning his back to her, running a hand through his dark hair. His breathing was ragged. "We have the evidence," he said, his voice rough. "But it is not enough to simply know it. We must present it. And we must do it in a way that he cannot hide from." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, missing his warmth immediately. She forced her mind back to the war they were fighting. The magistrate. "Eventually," Sebastian said, turning back to face her. His mask was back in place, but his eyes were still burning. "But first, we must draw him out. We need him to incriminate himself publicly. We need to strip him of his allies before we strike the final blow." "How?" Clara asked. "The winter ball," Sebastian declared. "It is in 3 days. Every peer in the county will be here, including Wickham. He expects to see you broken or hidden away in shame. He expects me to be struggling with his lawsuit." Paul. He walked over to the desk and closed the damning granary log, placing his hand flat on the cover. "Instead," Sebastian said, "he will see the future mistress of Alverton Hall. You will not attend as my librarian, Clara. You will attend as my guest of honor. We will use this ball to show him that he has already lost. And when he panics, when he tries to strike at you, we will be ready," Clara finished, understanding the game. "Go to bed," Sebastian commanded gently. "Sleep. You have earned it. The real battle begins when the music starts." Clara nodded. She moved to the door, pausing with her hand on the brass handle. She looked back at him. He was standing by the desk, a lone figure amidst the mountains of paper, guarding the truth she had unearthed. "Good night, Sebastian," she whispered, testing the name again. He looked up, and for a second, the Iron Duke was gone. Just a man remained. "Good night, Clara." She closed the door, her heart full of hope and terror. They had the weapon they needed. Now, they just had to survive long enough to use it. The invitations had been sent out on thick cream stationery, embossed with the ducal crest, causing a flurry of excitement that rippled through the county like a stone thrown into a stagnant pond. The Duke of Alverton was hosting a ball. It was unheard of. Sebastian Sterling was known for his reclusive nature, his disdain for the frivolous pageantry of the season, and his utter lack of interest in the marriage market. Yet, the gates of Alverton Hall were thrown open, and the carriage lamps of half the aristocracy in England were now winding their way up the long, frost-dusted driveway. Inside the East Suite, the air was thick with the scent of lavender water and heated iron. Clara stood before a tall, gilt-framed mirror, barely recognizing the woman who stared back at her. The modiste from the village, a woman who had trembled when measuring Clara under the Duke's watchful eye, had outdone herself. The dress was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk, dark enough to be respectable for a woman of her reduced circumstances, but rich enough to catch the candlelight with every movement. It had long sleeves of delicate lace and a high neckline that emphasized the length of her throat, modest, yet undeniably regal. There were no jewels around her neck. She possessed none. But on her finger, the heavy gold signet ring of the Stelmore barony gleamed, a defiant anchor to her past. "You look like a queen, miss," Mrs. Hesse whispered, adjusting the final pin in Clara's hair. The honey-blonde strands had been swept up into an intricate chignon, exposing the nape of her neck. "His Grace will be pleased." "His Grace is not looking for a queen, Mrs. Hesse," Clara replied, her voice steady though her stomach churned with nausea. "He is looking for a weapon. Tonight is not a celebration. It is a battlefield. Then you are dressed for war," the housekeeper said firmly, handing Clara a pair of long white gloves. "Go down there. Hold your head high. Remember who you are." Clara took a deep breath, inhaling the courage the older woman offered. She pulled on the gloves, hiding the calluses that still lingered on her palms, the last physical evidence of her year in servitude. Tonight, she could not be the maid who scrubbed floors. Tonight, she had to be Miss Clara Stelmore, the archivist of Alverton Hall, a woman under the personal protection of the most powerful man in the district. She left the safety of her room and walked down the long, silent corridor toward the gallery that overlooked the grand ballroom. The music drifted up to greet her, a string quartet playing a waltz that sounded heartbreakingly familiar. Below, the scene was a kaleidoscope of color and movement. Hundreds of candles flickered in the crystal chandeliers, casting a golden haze over the sea of guests. Diamonds sparkled on throats and wrists, feathers bobbed in elaborate hairstyles, and the hum of conversation was a dull roar of gossip and judgment. Clara paused at the top of the sweeping marble staircase. Her hand gripped the cold stone of the balustrade. Somewhere in that crush of people was the Earl of Wickham. He would be there. His vanity would not allow him to refuse an invitation from a duke, even one he was currently suing. He would be waiting to see her fail, to see her crumble under the weight of the society that had rejected her. "Do not falter now," a low voice murmured beside her. Clara started, turning to find Sebastian standing in the shadows of the alcove. He was breathtaking. He wore formal evening dress, severe black, relieved only by the stark white of his cravat and the star of a chivalric order pinned to his chest. His dark hair was brushed back, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference, but his blue eyes burned with a fierce, quiet intensity as they swept over her. "I did not hear you approach," Clara said, her heart skipping a beat. "I have been waiting for you," Sebastian replied. He stepped out of the shadows, offering his arm. He did not look at her dress or her hair. He looked directly into her eyes. "You are trembling." "I am terrified," she admitted. "They all know, Sebastian. They know I served drinks on my knees. They know my father died in ruin. I am walking into a room full of people who believe I belong in the gutter." "Let them believe what they wish," Sebastian said, placing his hand over hers where it rested on his sleeve. The warmth of his touch seeped through the silk of her glove, grounding her. "Tonight, you are not the daughter of a bankrupt baron. You are the woman who holds the key to their destruction. You know the truth of the ledgers. You know who is a thief and who is honest. You have more power in your little finger than Wickham has in his entire estate." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that brushed against her ear. "And you have me. I will not leave your side until the trap is sprung. Trust me." "I do," she breathed. "Then let us go," he said. "The wolves are waiting." They began the descent. As they stepped into the light of the chandeliers, the footman at the base of the stairs struck the floor with his staff. "His Grace, the Duke of Alverton," the man bellowed, his voice cutting through the music. "And Miss Clara Stelmore." The effect was instantaneous. The music did not stop, but the conversation died as if someone had sucked the air out of the room. Hundreds of heads turned, Fans froze in mid-flutter. Glasses were lowered. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with shock. To enter with the Duke was a statement. To be announced alongside him, with her full title restored, was a declaration of war against the rumours. Clara felt the weight of the stairs physically, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking her skin. She saw Lady Clifton whisper behind her hand to her daughter. She saw the vicar's wife drop her jaw, but she kept her chin lifted, her gaze fixed on a point in the distance, miming the arrogance she had seen Sebastian wear like armour. They reached the bottom of the stairs and moved into the crowd. The sea of bodies parted for them, a path clearing as if by magic. Sebastian guided her with a possessive hand on the small of her back, steering her toward the centre of the room. "Your Grace." Lord Remington bowed low as they passed, his eyes darting curiously to Clara. "A magnificent evening. And Miss Stelmore, a surprise indeed. We had heard you were away." "Miss Stelmore has been assisting me with the restoration of the Alverton archives," Sebastian said smoothly, his tone daring Remington to question it. "Her scholarship is invaluable. I would be lost without her." "Indeed," Remington stammered, backing away. They circulated through the room. It was a performance. Sebastian introduced her not as a charity case, but as an intellectual equal. He spoke of her work in the library, deferring to her on matters of history and literature. Slowly, the mood in the room shifted. The guests, taking their cue from the Duke, began to treat Clara with a tentative respect. If the Duke of Alverton valued her, then perhaps she was not a pariah after all. But Clara was not looking for acceptance. She was looking for him. She found him near the punch bowl, surrounded by a group of sycophants who were laughing too loudly at his jokes. The Earl of Wickham looked flushed, his cravat slightly askew, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked confident, the master of his universe, until he turned and saw her. The colour drained from his face so fast it was as if he had been struck. He stared at her, at the midnight blue silk, at the way she stood beside the Duke. His eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. "Steady," Sebastian whispered. "He is coming." Wickham excused himself from his group and began to cut a path toward them. He moved with the aggressive swagger of a bully who feels his territory is being threatened. Sebastian tensed, ready to intercept, but Clara squeezed his arm gently. "Let him come," she whispered. "I need to do this." Sebastian looked at her, searching her face. Then, with a reluctant nod, he stepped back. Not far, just enough to give the illusion that she was vulnerable. He remained a looming presence a few feet away, a silent sentinel ready to strike if the line was crossed. Wickham stopped in front of her. He did not bow. He looked her up and down with a sneer of contempt, his eyes lingering on the expensive fabric of her gown. "Well, well," Wickham drawled, his voice thick with wine and malice. "The scullery maid plays at being a lady. I must say, Clara, the Duke is generous with his charity. Did you pay for that dress with your wages, or did you pay for it with something else?" The insult was gross, designed to humiliate her instantly. A month ago, Clara would have burst into tears. Now, she felt only a cold, crystalline anger. "I paid for it with my work, Lord Wickham," Clara replied, her voice clear and carrying over the nearby chatter. Cataloguing the truth is a lucrative profession. It is surprising what one finds when one organises old papers. Mistakes in accounting, for example. Missing harvest yields. Wickham flinched, his eyes darting nervously to Sebastian, who was watching him with the impassive gaze of a hangman. The Earl leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a hiss, invading her personal space with the sour smell of brandy. "You think you are clever," he spat. "You think because you warm the Duke's bed you are safe. You are nothing. You are a bankrupt little girl playing a dangerous game, and you have forgotten who holds the leash." "I have forgotten nothing," Clara said coldly. "Then remember your mother," Wickham whispered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Remember Lady Stelmore. She is fragile, isn't she? The doctors at the asylum say she cries for you every night. It costs a fortune to keep her comfortable. A fortune I might decide to stop paying tomorrow morning. Think of it, Clara. Your mother, thrown out into the winter snow, confused and alone, because her daughter was too proud to know her place. It was the threat he had used to chain her. It was the nightmare that had kept her scrubbing his floors. But tonight, it was a hollow echo. Clara did not flinch. She took a small step forward, forcing Wickham to step back. She looked him in the eye, and for the first time she smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of the hawk on her father's crest. "My mother is not at the asylum, my lord," she said softly. Wickham froze. "What?" "The documents," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "The receipts I found in the crates you so foolishly sent over. You charged the estate £300 a month for St. Jude's Sanatorium, but there are no outgoing payments to St. Jude's in your ledger. Not one." "Administrative error," Wickham stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "My accountant—" "However," Clara interrupted, cutting him down, "I did find a recurring payment of £5 a month to a Mrs. Gable in the village of Oakhaven. A tenant farmer's widow. I sent a rider there yesterday, my lord. Imagine my surprise when he returned with a letter from my mother." Wickham's mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land. The blood rushed back into his face, turning it a mottled purple. "She is not in an asylum," Clara said, driving the knife home. "She is living in a cottage, acting as a governess to Mrs. Gable's children. You imprisoned her in poverty while charging my inheritance for luxury care. You stole the money meant for her medicine and pocketed it. You are not a guardian, Lord Wickham. You are a fraud, and now I have the proof. You lie!" Wickham choked out, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked around the room, paranoid, wondering how much the Duke knew. "No one will believe you. You are a hysteric." "I believe her." Sebastian's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. He stepped back into the circle, placing himself firmly between Clara and the Earl. He towered over Wickham, his presence radiating a lethal calm. "And more importantly," Sebastian continued, pitching his voice so that the surrounding guests, Lord Remington, Lady Clifton, the vicar, could hear every word, "the magistrate believes her. The audit is yielding fascinating results, Wickham. We shall discuss them in court. But for tonight, I suggest you remove yourself from my sight before I forget that I am a gentleman, and remember that I am the man who stopped your whip with his hand." Wickham looked at Sebastian, then at Clara. He saw the unity between them, the wall of steel he could not breach. He saw the eyes of the room turning toward him, sensing the scandal, smelling the blood in the water. "This is not over," Wickham hissed, backing away. "You will regret this arrogance." "The only regret here is yours," Clara said quietly, "for underestimating me." Wickham turned and fled. He did not walk with dignity. He scrambled through the crowd, disappearing toward the doors like a rat escaping a sinking ship. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees felt weak. The confrontation had been brief, but it had drained her. She swayed slightly, and immediately Sebastian's arm was there, supporting her, holding her up. "You were magnificent," he whispered, his voice rough with admiration. "He is running. You broke him." "He will come back," Clara said, watching the empty doorway. "He is cornered now. He will be dangerous." "Let him try," Sebastian said. The music swelled, the orchestra beginning a new waltz. The couples on the floor began to whirl. Sebastian turned to her, ignoring the hundreds of eyes watching them. He bowed formally, extending his hand, the hand with the faint white scar across the palm. "Miss Stellmore," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" It was the final seal of protection. To dance with the Duke was to be anointed by him. It was a public declaration that she was under his wing, beyond the reach of gossip or earls. Clara looked at his hand, the hand that had bled for her. She placed her gloved fingers in his. "The honor is mine, Your Grace," she replied. He swept her onto the floor. As they moved into the dance, Sebastian pulled her slightly closer than propriety allowed. The world blurred into a spin of candlelight and blue silk. For the first time in her life, Clara did not feel like a spectator in her own story. She felt like the protagonist. "We have won the battle," Sebastian murmured as he turned her, his eyes locked on hers. "But not the war," Clara reminded him, tightening her grip on his shoulder. "No," he agreed. But tonight we dance. Tomorrow we finish him. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over her. She was safe. Her mother was alive. And the man holding her was not just a duke. He was her partner. As they spun beneath the golden lights, Clara Stellmore finally allowed herself to believe that the winter of her life was ending, and that perhaps, just perhaps, spring was beginning to bloom in the heart of the Iron Duke. The triumph of the winter ball had tasted like sweet champagne, effervescent and intoxicating, but the morning that followed brought with it the bitter dregs of reality. The euphoria of the dance, of the public vindication, had been a momentary ceasefire in a war that was rapidly turning scorched earth. The library of Alverton Hall, usually a sanctuary of silence and dust, was pacing with the restless energy of a command tent before battle. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of snow that had been looming for days. Inside, the fire crackled in the grate, but it did little to chase away the chill that had settled over the room. Sebastian stood by the window, his back rigid, his hands clasped behind him. He was no longer the elegant host in evening silk. He was the landlord, the master of the estate, dressed in riding leathers and a heavy wool coat. His expression, reflected in the glass, was thunderous. "He has blocked the mill bridge," Sebastian said, his voice low and vibrating with a fury he was struggling to contain. At dawn, Wickham's men felled 3 oaks across the span and posted armed guards. He claims the bridge sits on a disputed easement dating back to his grandfather's time. He is demanding a toll from every tenant who tries to cross. Clara sat at her desk, her hands folded tightly on top of a stack of correspondence. She wore a simple day dress of slate blue, the high collar scratching against her throat. But that bridge is the only route to the market for the western farms. If they cannot cross, their winter stores will spoil. He is not hurting you, Sebastian. He is hurting them. He knows that. Sebastian turned, his blue eyes hard. He does not care about the farmers. He cares about drawing me out. It is a distraction, Clara. A crude, desperate tantrum designed to force me away from this house and away from the legal proceedings. "Then do not go," Clara said, though she knew even as she spoke the words that it was impossible. "I must," he replied, walking over to the desk. He placed his hands on the polished wood, leaning down until his face was level with hers. "If I allow him to bully my tenants, I lose my authority. A duke who cannot protect his people is no duke at all. Wickham is counting on my pride, yes, but he is also counting on my duty. He knows I cannot sit here reading ledgers while families starve because of his pettiness." Clara looked at him, seeing the conflict warring behind his eyes. He wanted to stay. She could see the protective instinct radiating off him in waves. He did not want to leave her alone, not after the threats Wickham had whispered at the ball. "You must go," Clara conceded, reaching out to cover his hand with hers. The scar on his palm was a stark white line against his skin, a reminder of the last time he had intervened against Wickham's violence. "The tenants depend on you. I will be safe here. Reynolds has doubled the guard at the gates, and I have no intention of leaving the library. I have work to do." Sebastian turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. His grip was tight, bordering on painful. "I will take half the stable guard with me to clear the bridge. It will take time, perhaps 2 days if he decides to make a legal stand of it. I am leaving Reynolds and the rest of the men here. You are not to step foot outside the garden walls, Clara. Promise me." "I promise," she said softly. "I will be here when you return, likely buried under another pile of receipts." He looked at her for a long moment, as if memorizing the curve of her face. Then, with a suddenness that stole her breath, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of courtly grace, but the heat of his mouth against her skin was searingly intimate. "Find the final piece, Clara," he whispered against her skin. "Find the proof that buries him, and when I return, we will finish this." With that, he was gone. The heavy oak doors closed with a resounding thud, leaving Clara alone in the vast, silent room. She sat for a moment, listening to the fading sound of hooves on the gravel drive, as Sebastian and his men rode out to face the Earl's blockade. The house seemed to settle around her, the shadows stretching longer, as the morning light struggled to penetrate the cloud cover. He is trying to distract us, she thought, pulling the heavy ledger toward her. Wickham is terrified. He is flailing. She returned to the work. The audit was nearly complete. They had proven the mismanagement, the embezzlement of the mother's care funds, and the skimming of the harvest profits, but they were still missing the cornerstone of the fraud, the legal mechanism by which Wickham had seized the title to the land itself. The bankruptcy had been the excuse, but the transfer of the deed was the legal instrument. Hours bled into one another. The only sound was the scratching of her quill and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Lunch arrived on a tray brought by a maid who looked nervous, her eyes darting to the windows as if expecting Wickham's men to burst through the glass. Clara ate mechanically, her eyes never leaving the papers. By mid-afternoon, the rain began. It lashed against the panes, turning the view of the gardens into a blurred watercolour of grey and green. Clara rubbed her temples, her eyes aching from the strain of deciphering the faded ink of the old contracts. She was working through the final crate, the one containing her father's personal correspondence from the weeks leading up to his death. It was painful reading. The letters painted a portrait of a man who knew he was dying, who was frantic to secure his daughter's future, and who trusted his cousin Wickham implicitly. My dear Malcolm, one letter read, dated 3 days before the Baron's death. I am reassured by your promise to watch over Clara. The fever is taking my strength, but knowing the estate will be managed by family gives me peace. Clara wiped a tear from her cheek. Her father had died believing he was leaving her in safe hands. The betrayal was so absolute, it made her chest ache. She reached for the next document in the stack. It was a thick bundle of papers tied with black ribbon, labelled Estate Transfer Protocols. She untied the ribbon, her fingers trembling slightly. This was it. The official transfer of the Stelmore barony's assets to the Earl of Wickham to satisfy the outstanding debts. She opened the document. It was written in dense legalese, outlining the surrender of the manor, the tenancies, the livestock, and the personal effects. She scanned the pages, looking for the signatures. There, at the bottom of the final page, was her father's signature, Baron Arthur Stelmore. It was shaky, the handwriting of a man weak with fever, but it was unmistakably his. Beside it was Wickham's bold, arrogant scrawl. Clara frowned. Something was wrong. She looked at the date next to Wickham's signature. November 15th, 1851. She looked at the date next to her father's signature. November 15th, 1851. The air in the library seemed to vanish. Clara stopped breathing. She stared at the date, her mind racing back to the terrible night her father had died. She remembered the storm. She remembered the doctor closing his bag. She remembered the clock chiming midnight. Her father had died on the morning of November 12th. Clara stood up, knocking her chair back. It clattered loudly onto the floor, but she didn't hear it. She grabbed the death certificate she had retrieved from the parish records weeks ago. She slapped it onto the desk beside the deed. Date of death, November 12th, 1851. The deed was signed 3 days after he was dead. He forged it, Clara whispered, the realization crashing over her like a physical blow. He didn't just trick him. He forged the signature after Papa was gone. It wasn't just fraud. It was a capital crime. It was a clumsy, arrogant mistake made by a man who thought no one would ever check the dates, who thought the daughter he planned to enslave would never have the means or the mind to investigate. The signature looked real because Wickham had likely practiced it, or perhaps he had traced it from another document. But the date was the smoking gun. Wickham had notarized the transfer on the day he took possession, forgetting, or not caring, to backdate it to when Arthur Stelmore was still alive. This was the end of him. With this document, the Earl of Wickham would not just lose his lawsuit, he would lose his freedom. He would hang, or he would rot in prison for the rest of his life. Clara clutched the document to her chest, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. She had done it. She had the head of the monster. "Reynolds!" she called out, running toward the door. "Reynolds!" The butler appeared almost instantly, his face pale. "Miss Stelmore, is something wrong?" Where is the nearest magistrate? Clara demanded, breathless. Not the local constable, the king's magistrate, the circuit judge. Reynolds blinked, confused by her intensity. Lord Justice Halloway. He is in Oakhaven today, miss. He holds court there once a month before travelling to the northern districts. Oakhaven, Clara repeated. That was the village where her mother was hiding. It was 10 miles away. 2 punishing hours on a road that turned to sludge whenever the skies opened. He is there today? Yes, miss. But he leaves for London tomorrow morning at first light. The roads are bad with the rain. He will not delay. Clara looked at the grandfather clock. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon. If she waited for Sebastian to return from the bridge, it would be too late. Halloway would be gone, disappearing into the labyrinth of the London courts for months. And Wickham. A sudden, chilling thought stopped her cold. Wickham knew she was looking. He knew the audit was happening. He had sent these crates as a distraction, thinking they were too disorganized to yield results quickly. But after the ball, after she had humiliated him publicly, he would be panicked. If he realized his mistake with the dates, if he realized the deed was in this house. Reynolds, Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Who brought the post today? The usual boy from the village, miss, Reynolds replied. And, well, there was a man asking about the Duke's schedule, a peddler selling ribbons. I sent him away. A peddler? Clara asked sharply. Did he see the Duke leave? I suppose he might have, miss. He was near the gates when the cavalcade rode out. Clara's blood ran cold. Wickham had spies. He knew Sebastian was gone. He knew the house was defended only by Reynolds and a few aging guards. And he knew the evidence that could hang him was sitting on this desk. She looked at the document in her hand. It was just paper. Fragile, flammable paper. If Wickham sent men tonight, not lawyers, but the kind of men who blocked bridges and beat servants, they wouldn't ask for the document. They would burn the library. They would burn the house to destroy the proof. She could not wait. She could not risk this document staying in the house one more night. I have to go to Oakhaven, Clara announced, her decision crystallizing into hard resolve. Miss. Reynolds looked horrified. The Duke gave strict orders. You are not to leave the grounds. The roads are dangerous, and with the Earl's men about, the Duke is defending the bridge. Clara cut him off. He cannot help me, and if I stay here, I put this house and everyone in it in danger. Reynolds, this paper, she held it up, her hand shaking. This is the proof. It proves Wickham stole everything. If I get this to Judge Halloway before he leaves Oakhaven, Wickham is finished. Today. Forever. But the risk of doing nothing is greater, Clara insisted. If Wickham realizes what I have found, he will come for it. He will burn this hall to the ground to get it. I have to take it to the law. Now. She moved past him, heading for the stairs. Saddle a horse. Not a carriage. It's too slow and too conspicuous. Give me the mare I rode last week, and give me a cloak that doesn't look like it belongs to a duchess. Miss Stelmore, I cannot allow. You are not my jailer, Reynolds, Clara said, turning on the step. Her green eyes flashed with the same steel that Sebastian often wore. I am the archivist of this estate, and I am telling you that the safety of the Alverton legacy depends on me riding to Oakhaven. Do as I ask. Please. The butler hesitated, looking at the fragile young woman who had somehow become the spine of the household. He saw the determination in her face. With a heavy sigh, he nodded. I will have the mare ready at the scullery door. It is less visible from the road. Thank you, Clara whispered. She ran to her room. She did not pack a bag. She changed quickly into her warmest riding habit, a thick wool of dark green, and pulled on heavy boots. She grabbed a leather satchel and placed the deed inside, wrapping it in oilcloth to protect it from the rain. She added the death certificate and the granary log for good measure. Then she sat at her small writing desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. Her hand trembled as she dipped the quill, but her words were steady. Sebastian, I found it. The deed is a forgery. It is dated 3 days after my father died. He signed a dead man's name. Judge Halloway is in Oakhaven, but only until tomorrow. I cannot risk Wickham realizing what we have and coming for the proof while you are gone. I fear he knows you are away. I am taking the evidence to the magistrate myself. Do not be angry. I promise to stay safe, and the only way to be safe is to end this. I will wait for you at the inn in Oakhaven once the deed is done. Yours, Clara. She folded the letter and sealed it with wax. She did not use the Alverton crest. She pressed her thumb into the soft red wax, leaving a simple, personal mark. She hurried down the back stairs, the letter clutched in her hand. Reynolds was waiting by the scullery door, holding the reins of a sturdy chestnut mare. The rain was falling harder now, a dreary, relentless curtain that obscured the world beyond the garden wall. Give this to the Duke the moment he returns, Clara said, handing the letter to Reynolds. Tell him I did not run away. Tell him I ran toward the fight. Godspeed, miss, Reynolds said, his voice thick with worry. He helped her mount. Keep to the old wooded path. Avoid the main road until you reach the river. Wickham's men are likely watching the turnpike. I know the way, Clara said. She gathered the reins, feeling the horse shift beneath her. She was terrified. She was a woman alone, riding into a storm, carrying a document that was worth a fortune and a man's life. But beneath the fear, there was a fierce, burning exhilaration. She was no longer waiting to be saved. She was saving herself. She spurred the mare forward. The horse leaped into the rain, hooves churning the mud. Clara lowered her head against the wind, pulling her dark cloak tight around her. She rode out of the sanctuary of Alverton Hall and into the gathering dark, the satchel heavy against her side, echoing the beating of her heart. The ride was grueling. The wind whipped her face, stinging her eyes, and the mud sucked at the mare's hooves, slowing their pace. Clara kept to the tree line, her eyes scanning the shadows for movement. Every snapping branch sounded like a pistol shot. Every rustle of leaves sounded like an ambush. She thought of Sebastian, standing on the bridge, miles away, facing down Wickham's thugs. He was fighting for his tenants. She was fighting for their future. Just 10 miles, she told herself. Just 10 miles to Oakhaven. But as she crested the hill that overlooked the valley, she saw something that made her blood freeze. Below, on the main road that intersected the wooded path, a group of riders was waiting. They carried torches that hissed in the rain, casting long, flickering shadows. They were not wearing the Duke's livery. They were rough men, sitting on heavy cobs, watching the road to Oakhaven. Wickham had anticipated her. He knew the magistrate was leaving. He knew that if she found anything, she would have to run. He had blocked the bridge to draw Sebastian out, and he had blocked the road to catch her. Clara pulled the mare to a halt, shrinking back into the cover of the trees. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She couldn't go back. The proof was too dangerous to keep at the hall. She couldn't go forward. The road was blocked. She looked at the satchel, the evidence. There was another way, a deer track that cut through the old quarry. It was steep, dangerous in this weather, and it bypassed the main road entirely. It would take her longer, and it would expose her to the open moorland, but it was the only path left. Come on, girl, she whispered to the mare, patting her wet neck. We have to be brave. She turned the horse away from the road and into the deep woods, plunging into the darkness. She did not know that behind her, on the ridge she had just left, a solitary figure had lowered a spyglass and spurred his horse away to report that the bird had flown the coop, and she was heading exactly where they wanted her. Clara rode on, driven by the memory of her father's signature and the promise of the Duke's kiss, unaware that she was riding straight into the heart of the trap. The ancient deer track that cut through the abandoned quarry was a treacherous scar on the landscape, a narrow path of slick slate and mud that wound perilously close to the drop-off. The storm had turned the world into a chaotic void of wind and water, the rain slashing down in sheets that obscured everything beyond the horse's ears. Clara crouched low over the mare's neck, her fingers tangled in the coarse mane, whispering frantic prayers into the gale. Every slip of a hoof sent a jolt of terror through her spine, but she dared not slow down. The main road was blocked. The trap was set. This was the only way to the magistrate, the only way to save the future. She pressed the satchel tighter against her side. The deed inside felt heavy, burning with the heat of the truth it contained. November 12th versus November 15th. Those 3 days were the difference between poverty and justice, between a lie and a hanging. The mare scrambled up a steep embankment, her breath coming in ragged heaves, and burst through a thicket of holly onto the edge of the moorland. Oakhaven was less than 2 miles away now. Clara could see the faint, flickering lights of the village in the valley below, shining like distant stars in the abyss. "We are going to make it," she gasped, the wind tearing the words from her mouth. "We are going to—" The shadow detached itself from the tree line with terrifying speed. Before Clara could scream, a heavy hand grabbed the mare's bridle, jerking the animal's head down violently. The horse reared, screaming in panic. Clara was thrown backward, her boots slipping from the stirrups. She hit the wet earth with a bone-jarring thud, the breath driven from her lungs. Through the mud splattered across her vision, she saw figures emerging from the darkness. 3 men. They were not the uniformed guards of the bridge. These were rough, shapeless forms in oilskins, their faces hidden by low hats and scarves. Mercenaries, the kind of men who did not ask questions as long as the coin was gold. "Got her," one of them grunted, his voice rough as gravel. He loomed over her, grabbing her arm and hauling her up as if she weighed nothing. "The Earl said she'd try the back way. Clever little bird, aren't you?" "Let me go," Clara fought, kicking out wildly. Her boot connected with the shin, eliciting a curse, but the grip on her arm only tightened, bruising the flesh. "I am under the protection of the Duke of Alverton. If you touch me, he will hunt you down." "The Duke is busy playing soldier at the bridge, love," the man sneered, dragging her toward a waiting carriage that had been hidden in a copse of trees. It was a nondescript black vehicle, stripped of any crest, looking like a hearse in the rain. "By the time he gets back, you'll be a married woman, and a husband has rights a duke can't touch." Clara went cold. Marriage. That was the plan. If they forced her to marry, her property and her rights to sue would transfer to her husband. Wickham wouldn't marry her himself. That was too scandalous. He would marry her to a proxy, a puppet who would sign everything over to him. She struggled harder, twisting her body, reaching for the satchel that had fallen in the mud. "My papers! You cannot—" "Forget the papers," another man said, kicking the satchel into the ditch. "The Earl just wants the girl." They shoved her into the carriage. The interior smelled of stale tobacco and mould. The door slammed shut, the lock engaging with a final metallic click. As the carriage lurched into motion, bouncing violently over the uneven ground, Clara scrambled to the window. She saw her satchel lying in the rain, abandoning the decoy papers she had placed there, but she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the crinkle of parchment beneath her woolen bodice. The deed, the real deed, was safe, wrapped in oilcloth and pinned to her chemise. They had the girl, but they did not know she was carrying the noose that would hang their master. The destination was not Wickham Park, nor was it the village of Oakhaven. The carriage rattled for an hour before turning into the courtyard of a dilapidated coaching inn known as the Hangman's Rest, a place avoided by respectable travellers. The sign creaked ominously in the wind as Clara was hauled out into the downpour. She was marched through the back door, through a kitchen that smelled of boiled cabbage and grease, and into a private parlour where a fire roared in the grate. Standing by the fire, warming his hands as if he were at a social club, was the Earl of Wickham. He turned as they entered, a smile of triumphant malice spreading across his flushed face. Beside him stood a thin, pale man with watery eyes and a nervous twitch. Clara recognised him vaguely as Mr. Collins, a distant cousin of the Wickham line, a man known for his gambling debts and lack of spine. And in the corner, holding a prayer book with trembling hands, was a defrocked parson who smelled of gin. "Clara," Wickham purred, stepping forward. "You look like a drowned rat. I told you the roads were dangerous." "You blocked the roads," Clara spat, shaking off the mercenary's hand and standing tall, despite the water dripping from her hair. "You are a coward, Malcolm. Kidnapping? Is this how a peer of the realm conducts business?" "This is not kidnapping," Wickham corrected smoothly, pouring himself a glass of wine. "This is a family intervention. You are unwell, my dear. Hysterical. You ran away from your legal guardian. I am simply ensuring your future is secured before your madness destroys you completely." He gestured to the pale man. "You remember your cousin, Mr. Collins. He has long admired you. He has graciously agreed to take you as his wife, despite your ruined reputation. Once the vows are spoken, he will assume control of your affairs. He has already agreed to sign the management of the Stelmore estate over to me, to relieve himself of the burden." "I will not say the vows," Clara said, her voice shaking with rage. "I will scream. I will refuse. A marriage under duress is not legal." "Who will know?" Wickham laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "The parson is deaf to protests, and Mr. Collins is eager to consummate the union. Once the deed is done, Clara, the law will not care about your screams. You will be his wife, and I will be the master of Stelmore. Again." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Now, where are the documents? My men said you were carrying a satchel." "I lost it," Clara lied, holding his gaze. "In the woods. Your thugs threw it in a ditch." Wickham's face twitched. "No matter. The papers were likely just ramblings of a madwoman. The only signature that matters is the one you will place on the marriage license." He nodded to the parson. "Begin." "I will not," Clara shouted, backing away until she hit the wall. "This is a crime. You are committing treason against the crown." "I am the crown in this county," Wickham roared, losing his composure. He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin. "You will do as you are told, you ungrateful little—" Crash! The front door of the inn did not open. It exploded inward. The wood splintered with a sound like a cannon shot, sending shards flying across the hallway. Wickham froze. Mr. Collins squeaked and hid behind a chair. Through the ruined doorway, the storm seemed to enter the room. But it was not just the wind. Sebastian Sterling strode into the parlour. He was wet, covered in mud, his riding coat soaked through, but he looked like an avenging god carved from granite. He held a pistol in one hand, the hammer cocked, and a heavy cavalry sabre in the other. His blue eyes were not cold tonight. They were blazing with a white-hot fury that promised death. He was not alone. Behind him, filling the hallway and spilling out into the courtyard, were 24 men in red coats, the king's militia, and flanking the Duke was a man in a black judicial robe, looking stern and terrified in equal measure. Lord Justice Halloway. "Step away from her," Sebastian said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, guttural command that vibrated in the floorboards. He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at the centre of Wickham's forehead. Wickham released Clara instantly, stumbling back, his hands raised. "Your Grace, this is a misunderstanding, a private family matter. The girl is my ward. I was merely—" "You were forcing a marriage," Sebastian interrupted, stepping into the room. He did not look at Clara yet. He could not take his eyes off the threat. Kidnapping, assault, conspiracy. "She is insane!" Wickham screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Clara. "She ran away. I have the right to retrieve her." "You have no rights," Sebastian roared, the control finally snapping. "You forfeited your rights the moment you touched her." He turned slightly, signalling to the magistrate. "Lord Justice Halloway, you have heard the accusations. Now witness the crime." Justice Halloway stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. "Lord Wickham, I was dining in Oakhaven when His Grace arrived with an urgent summons. He claims you are attempting to subvert the course of justice regarding the Stelmore estate." "Lies," Wickham spat, rallying his arrogance. "The Duke is besotted with the girl. He is harassing me. There is no proof of any wrongdoing regarding the estate. The transfer was legal, signed by the Baron himself." Clara pushed herself off the wall. Her hands were shaking, but she reached into the neckline of her dress. She ripped the oilcloth packet free, the sound tearing through the tension in the room. "Show him the proof, Clara," Sebastian said softly, finally looking at her. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second, checking her for injuries, before snapping back to Wickham. Clara stepped forward, walking past the cowering Mr. Collins. She handed the packet to the magistrate. "This is the deed of transfer, Your Honour," Clara said, her voice ringing clear and strong. "It assigns all Stelmore lands to Lord Wickham to satisfy the alleged debts." "Standard procedure," Wickham sneered. "A legal document." "Look at the date, my lord," Clara commanded the judge. "Look at the date beside my father's signature." Justice Halloway unfolded the parchment. He adjusted his spectacles, squinting in the firelight. "November the 15th, 1851. And here," Clara slammed the death certificate onto the table next to the deed, "is the parish record of my father's burial. He died on November the 12th. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Wickham's face turned the colour of ash. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "He signed a dead man's name," Clara declared, looking Wickham in the eye. "He forged the signature 3 days after my father took his last breath. He didn't purchase the debt, Your Honour. He stole the inheritance." Justice Halloway looked from the papers to the Earl. His expression hardened from confusion to judicial wrath. "Lord Wickham, can you explain how a man 3 days in his grave signed this document?" It was a clerical error," Wickham stammered, backing away until he hit the table. "The clerk, he must have—" "It is forgery," Sebastian said, lowering his pistol but keeping it ready. "It is fraud against the crown. And combined with the kidnapping of the primary witness, it is treason," Justice Halloway finished grimly. He turned to the militia captain. "Captain, arrest the Earl of Wickham, and Mr. Collins, and that priest." "No!" Wickham shrieked as the soldiers surged forward. "I am a peer of the realm. You cannot touch me. I am an earl." "You are a criminal," Sebastian said coldly. The soldiers grabbed Wickham. He fought, kicking and screaming obscenities, his dignity stripped away entirely. They shackled his hands, the same hands that had held a whip over Clara, and dragged him toward the door. As he passed Clara, he lunged at her, teeth bared like a cornered animal. But Sebastian stepped in front of her, a wall of black wool and steel. Wickham was hauled out into the rain, his screams fading as he was thrown into the militia wagon. Mr. Collins was weeping openly as he was led away. The parson had fainted. The room emptied of soldiers, leaving only the magistrate, Sebastian, and Clara. "I will need to take these documents into evidence, Miss Stelmore," Justice Halloway said gently, picking up the deed with reverence. "This will be a long trial, but with this, the outcome is certain. You have done the Crown a great service." "Thank you, Your Honour," Clara whispered. The magistrate bowed to the Duke and retreated, closing the shattered door as best he could to give them privacy. The moment they were alone, the adrenaline that had been holding Clara upright evaporated. Her knees buckled. Sebastian dropped his weapons. They clattered onto the floorboards, forgotten. He crossed the distance between them in a single stride, catching her before she hit the ground. "Clara!" he choked out, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his wet coat. He didn't care about the mud, or the propriety, or the blood on his knuckles where he had smashed the door lock. He buried his face in her neck, breathing her in as if to reassure himself she was real. "I thought I was too late. When I found your note, when I realized you had gone into the woods." Clara clung to him, her hands gripping the lapels of his coat. She was shaking violently, the terror of the last hour finally releasing its grip. "I had to come. He knew you were gone. He would have burned the library." "Damn the library!" Sebastian pulled back, gripping her face in his hands. His eyes were wild, searching hers. "Let it burn. Let the whole estate burn to ash. Do you think I care about papers? I care about you." The confession hung in the air, stark and undeniable. "You rode into a trap," he said, his thumbs brushing the tears and rain from her cheeks. "You risked everything." "I was saving us," she whispered. "I was saving the future." "You are the future," Sebastian said fiercely. "My future. And I swear to you, Clara, by everything I hold sacred, no one will ever touch you again. I will tear the world apart before I let you come to harm." He lowered his forehead to hers, their breaths mingling in the cold air of the inn. "I was at the bridge when Reynolds brought the note. I have never ridden harder in my life. I stopped at Oakhaven only long enough to drag Halloway from his dinner. I knew Wickham would try to intercept you before the village. I knew he would bring you here." "How?" she asked. "Because it is where his father used to conduct his illicit business," Sebastian said darkly. "I knew the darkest holes of this county, and I knew he would drag you to the deepest one." He kissed her forehead, then her temple, gentle, reverent kisses that were a stark contrast to the violence of his arrival. "It is over, Clara. He is in chains. The deed is in the hands of the law. You are free." "Free," she repeated, the word tasting strange on her tongue. "Come," Sebastian said, wrapping his heavy coat around her shoulders, engulfing her in his warmth. "Let us go home. Not to the guest wing, not to the library. Home." He lifted her into his arms, carrying her out of the sordid inn and into the cleansing rain. The militia wagon was already moving down the road, taking the nightmare away. But Clara didn't look at it. She looked only at the man who carried her, the Iron Duke who had melted for her, whose heart beat steadily against her own. They rode back to Alverton Hall in the Duke's carriage, escorted by the remaining soldiers. Clara slept with her head on Sebastian's shoulder, his hand holding hers, his thumb tracing the line of the signet ring she still wore. The storm raged on outside, but inside there was only peace. The war was won. Now all that remained was to heal the wounds. England, February 1853. The cruel bite of winter had finally begun to loosen its jaw. The snow that had blanketed the rolling hills of the county for months was receding, revealing patches of earth that smelled of damp soil and the promise of renewal. The great frozen lakes around Alverton Hall were cracking, the ice groaning as it shifted to make way for the dark, flowing water beneath. It was a time of thawing, of hard things becoming soft again, and nowhere was this transformation more palpable than within the walls of the Duke's estate. 3 months had passed since the night the door of the Hangman's Rest had been shattered. 3 months since the Earl of Wickham had been dragged screaming into the darkness of a militia wagon. In the county jail, a damp stone fortress that sat on the edge of the moorland, the former Earl sat in a cell that measured 6 feet by 6 feet. Malcolm, once the Lord of Wickham Park, now wore rough-spun wool that scratched his skin, and his diet consisted of gruel rather than roasted pheasant. He had been stripped of his titles by an emergency decree of the House of Lords, pending his trial for treason and fraud. His allies had evaporated like mist. Mr. Collins had turned King's evidence to save his own neck, pouring out every secret of Wickham's illicit dealings to the magistrate. The man who had wielded a whip with impunity was now powerless, waiting for the hangman's noose or the transport ship to the colonies. Justice, slow and grinding, had finally come for him. But at Alverton Hall, the mood was not one of vengeance, but of quiet restoration. Clara Stelmore stood in the centre of the great library, a leather-bound volume in her hands. The room was bathed in the pale, clean light of the February afternoon. The dust that had once choked the air was gone. The piles of chaotic parchment had been sorted, filed, and bound. The chaos of centuries had been tamed into a system of elegant order. She ran her thumb over the spine of the book, a first edition of Milton that she had discovered beneath a stack of unpaid bills in the final crate. It was finished. The work was done. Clara was no longer the desperate girl in the grey dress. She wore a gown of deep emerald wool, tailored to perfection, befitting her restored station. The courts had moved with unusual speed, spurred on by the Duke's influence. The barony of Stelmore had been returned to her name. The fraudulent debts had been erased, and the assets Wickham had stolen were being liquidated to repay the estate. More importantly, the shadow that had hung over her heart had been lifted. 2 days ago, Clara had returned from the dower house at Stelmore Manor. She had supervised the installation of her mother, Lady Stelmore, into the newly repaired West Wing. The reunion had been a tearful, joyous thing. Her mother, frail but recovering, had wept to see her daughter not as a servant, but as the mistress of her own destiny. Wickham's lies about the asylum had been exposed for the cruelty they were. Her mother had been living in poverty, yes, but she was alive, and now she was safe, surrounded by servants paid for with Clara's own recovered fortune. The roof of their ancestral home was being thatched, the fires were lit, and the Stelmore legacy was breathing again. which meant that Clara had no reason to stay at Alverton Hall. The thoughts settled in her chest like a heavy stone. She had returned today only to collect her final personal effects and to formally resign her position as archivist. She was a baroness now, a woman of independent means. It was improper for her to remain under the roof of a bachelor duke, no matter how much that roof felt like the only home she had ever truly known. "The shelves look different," a deep voice said from the doorway. "They look disciplined." Clara turned. Sebastian stood there. He had been absent for the morning, attending to the final legal depositions with the magistrate, and he looked tired. He wore his riding clothes. The mud of the road splattered on his boots, his dark hair windblown. But his eyes, those intense blue eyes that had seen her at her lowest, were clear and focused solely on her. "They are organized, Your Grace," Clara corrected, her voice trembling slightly. "Every volume is catalogued. Every deed is filed. You will never have to wonder what you own again." Sebastian walked into the room, the sound of his boots on the floorboards echoing in the silence. He stopped a few feet away from her, respecting the distance, yet invading her senses with his presence. "And the archivist?" he asked. "Is she catalogued as well? Or is she filed under departing assets?" Clara looked down at the book in her hands. "My work is finished, Sebastian. The Stelmore estate requires my attention. The contractors are beginning the repairs on the main hall tomorrow, and my mother, she needs me. For the first time in years, she feels safe, but she is still fragile. I cannot abandon her." "I would never ask you to abandon her," Sebastian said softly. "I know what it costs to protect a parent. I know what you sacrificed for her." "Then you understand why I must go," Clara said, forcing herself to look at him. "I have stayed these last few months because of the trial, because of the transition. But now, I am a baroness. You are a duke. The world has rules, Sebastian. We have broken enough of them." "Rules," Sebastian scoffed, taking a step closer. "You speak of rules? The woman who rode alone into a storm to save a fortune? The woman who faced down an earl in a ballroom? Since when have you cared for the petty rules of a society that tried to crush you?" "I care about your reputation," Clara insisted. "And I care about not overstaying my welcome. You took me in when I was nothing. You saved me. I will be eternally grateful. But I will not be a burden that lingers because she has nowhere else to go." "I have somewhere to go now." Sebastian went very still. The air in the library seemed to tighten, charged with the same electric tension that had crackled between them on the night of the discovery. "Is that what you think you are?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "A burden?" "A charity case that I am waiting to discharge. I was a servant," Clara whispered. "I was the girl who spilled wine on your guest's boots. That is how this started." "No," Sebastian said. "That is not how it started. It started when I saw a woman standing in the mud, with more dignity in her silence than a roomful of lords had in their shouting. It started when I saw you look at a whip and refuse to beg." He closed the distance between them. He reached out and took the book from her hands, placing it on the desk without looking at it. Then he took her hands in his. He turned his right hand over, palm up. The scar was there, a thin white line that cut diagonally across the lifelines of his palm. It was fully healed now, a permanent mark of the violence he had intercepted. It was a brand of honor, a physical memory of the moment their blood had almost mingled. "Look at this," Sebastian commanded gently. Clara looked. She traced the scar with her fingertip, her skin brushing against the rougher texture of the healed wound. "I am sorry," she murmured. "It will never fade completely." "I hope not," Sebastian said. "I look at this hand every morning, Clara, and do you know what I see? I do not see pain. I do not see Wickham. I see the price of something precious." He curled his fingers around hers, trapping her hand against the scar. "You say your work is done," he continued, his voice gaining strength, resonating with a raw vulnerability she had never heard before. "You say the library is in order, but look around you. This room is cold without you. This house. It is a mausoleum of stone and echo. Before you came, I lived here like a ghost, haunting my own halls, fulfilling my duties, but feeling nothing. You did not just organize my books, Clara. You woke me up. Sebastian, I do not want an archivist, he interrupted, his eyes blazing. I can hire 100 men from Oxford to dust my books. I do not want a neighbor I see once a month at church. I do not want a memory of a woman who saved me. He released her hands only to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones, tilting her head up so she could not look away. I want the woman who stitched my hand in a carriage, he said. I want the woman who reads Plato and fights monsters. I want the partner who stood beside me when the world was against us. I love you, Clara. I have loved you since the moment you tore your dress to bind my wound. I loved you when you wore rags, and I love you now in silk. It makes no difference to me. You are the only equal I have ever found. Clara felt the tears spill over, hot and fast. The walls she had built to protect herself, the pride, the caution, the fear of rejection, crumbled into dust. I thought, she sobbed, a laugh breaking through the tears. I thought you only saw a problem to be solved, a wrong to be righted. You are not a problem. Sebastian smiled, wiping her tears away with his thumbs. You are the answer. You are the only answer that has ever mattered. He dropped to one knee. The movement was fluid, graceful, and shocking. The Duke of Alverton, a man who bowed to no one but the Queen, was kneeling on the floor of his library, amidst the dust motes and the winter light. Clara Stellmore, he said, looking up at her with an expression of absolute, unwavering devotion. I know you have your own estate now. I know you are independent. I would never ask you to give that up. Bring your mother here. Let us join Stellmore to Alverton. Let us build a kingdom that is ours, based not on debts and lies, but on truth and this fire that you lit in me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It was not the Stellmore signet. It was a ring of sapphire, dark and deep as the ocean, surrounded by diamonds. The sterling betrothal ring. Marry me, he asked. Be my duchess, not because you need saving, but because I cannot live this life without you. Fight with me, read with me, rule with me. Clara looked down at him. She looked at the scar on his hand, the symbol of his protection. She looked at the ring, the symbol of his promise. And she looked at the man, the Iron Duke, who had allowed himself to bleed for a servant girl. There was no hesitation, no doubt. The future stretched out before her, not as a lonely path of duty, but as a shared journey of joy. Yes, she whispered. Sebastian let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. Yes? Yes, she said, louder, laughing through her tears. I will marry you. I will be your duchess. I will be your librarian. I will be whatever you need, as long as you promise never to let me go. Never, Sebastian swore. He stood up and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that swept away the last lingering chill of winter. It was a kiss of promise, of sealed fates and healed hearts. In the silence of the library, surrounded by the stories of 1,000 years, they began their own story. A story not of tragedy, but of triumph. And so, the winter of 1853 turned into spring. The ice melted from the lakes, feeding the rivers that ran through the valleys. The flowers bloomed in the gardens of Alverton Hall, vibrant and wild. Lord Wickham was eventually transported to Van Diemen's Land, where he spent the remainder of his days breaking rocks under a sun that offered no mercy, a fitting end for a man who had shown none. Clara and Sebastian were married in the village chapel in May. It was not a sombre affair of state, but a celebration that included every tenant, every farmer, and every servant who had stood by them. Lady Stellmore sat in the front row, weeping tears of joy, watching her daughter, the girl who had been broken, stand tall and radiant beside the man who had helped her put the pieces back together. They lived a life that became a legend in the county. They were partners in every sense of the word. They managed the lands together. They filled the nursery with children who grew up knowing the value of kindness and courage. And they spent their evenings in the great library, reading aloud to one another as the fire crackled in the hearth. Clara kept the scar on Sebastian's hand as her most precious reminder. It was the map that had led her home. She learned that love was not about perfection, nor was it about the absence of pain. Love was the hand that caught the whip. Love was the bandage in the dark. Love was the courage to stand when the world told you to kneel. As the years passed, the story of the Maid and the Duke was whispered by the firesides of the tenant cottages. It became a fable of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest winter, spring is inevitable for those who endure.